tonight we're very pleased to have Jan Eliasberg joining us from New York City. She's in Greenwich Village. We're hanging out here in Albuquerque. Jan is a renowned TV and film writer and director. She's written for many shows that you probably recognize. Some of these I grew up watching and watched my parents watching, things like Miami Vice, for instance. She's also written for Wise Guy, Parenthood, NCIS LA, Blue Bloods, Supernatural. And also she's written some work with about strong female leads, which is a big part of her new book, Hannah's War, including Fly Girls, which was about the women air service pilot too. And that was a project she did with Nicole Kidman and Cameron Diaz. So I know we're very excited to hear about the new book and also maybe hear about some of your other work, Jan. Thanks so much for joining us. Phyllis, would you like to take it away?
I would love to. Thank you, Amanda. Amanda and I go way back. We have produced lots of wonderful authors over the years, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Jan, I'm just going to start with a question that I know we could probably spend the next half hour discussing, and that is your inspiration for writing and telling the story of Hannah, and why now?
Well, the inspiration was an absolute crystalline moment in time, which is not always the case. But I was in the New York Public Library microfiche room, and I was actually researching the program that Amanda was, the script Amanda was talking about the women air service pilots in World War II. And I wanted to see the front page of the New York Times on the day the war ended, which of course was the day that we bombed Hiroshima. And I called up the microfiche, and there was this enormous headline, X number of thousand killed, of course, Truman vows reign of ruin. And then the New York Times, being the paper of record, had to tell the entire world about this Manhattan Project, which had been going on in secret. And even scientists who were actually working at Los Alamos, a lot of them didn't know that they were working on a bomb. They were told that they were there doing work on submarines or, it was all incredibly hush-hush. So here's this historical article talking about the development all the way through. And there was a paragraph. It said the key component that allowed the Allies to develop the bomb was brought to the Allies by a female non-Aryan physicist. No name. Now, I knew non-Aryan meant Jewish. It was kind of interesting that the New York Times in 1945 didn't even use the word Jewish, but the minute I saw that, I thought, a female physicist, Jewish, why don't I know this woman, and why isn't her face staring out of every science textbook in the world? Because it was the most monumental discovery of the 20th century. So that set me on a journey to find this woman in history and tell her story. But as I started to explore that time period, many, many other moments began to come to life for me, including what was going on at Los Alamos in 1945, right down the block from you guys. And so my story ended up kind of spanning 1938 to 1945 with this woman, fictionalized, but still very much inspired by Dr. Lisa Meitner, who did actually discover splitting the atom.
Thank you. As was mentioned, but I'm going to augment it, you are an award-winning TV and film writer and director. What made you choose to tell the story as a novel And how did your background help you as a fiction writer in shaping Hannah's War?
Okay, that's a double question, but I
It
want
is. And you get ample time to answer, Jan.
So the first question is actually, it took some time. I spent many years researching the story, not full time. I was directing, I was writing different scripts, but the story it just would not, it wouldn't let me go. The story found me and it grabbed on and wouldn't let me go. So I was doing research and I went back and forth. I began, first I thought, well, maybe this could be a screenplay. And then I thought, well, I don't know, maybe it could be a novel. And so I kind of played with it in both forms. And ultimately, I think there were two reasons I decided on the novel form. One was my experience with that screenplay about the women air service pilots in World War II, because even with Nicole Kidman and Cameron Diaz attached to star in it, nobody wanted to make it. Wow. And I was shocked. I mean, it was a great story. We've told many stories about pilots in World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen, and of course, English pilots, American pilots, but we had never told the story of these incredible women. And I just couldn't believe that nobody would want to take a chance and make that movie. And I think that I felt like I do not want to go down that road with this woman, Hannah, whom I'd become quite attached to. And a screenplay is not a complete work. A screenplay is the end of the writing process. Then the directing process comes and it's interpretive. And then the editing process is almost a process of rewriting. And there was no way that I felt like I could just hand someone the screenplay and say, read about this woman and her amazing story. And so I decided that fiction was the home. And I also, in hindsight, but this may have been in my mind also, in movies, it's very hard to think of a truly strong, complex woman hero who is really the active person driving the story. In the 30s, All About Eve, yes, the great screwball comedies, Rosalind Russell and His Girl Friday. But think about the kind of movies that we're seeing now, and it becomes more and more difficult to find those women. And Hannah is indeed, well, she's a nuclear physicist. How much more brilliant could she be? Right. And as I was writing her, I knew that because she has a lot of secrets, she was also going to be guarded and not necessarily likable. That word that sort of, it gets thrown around when you're making movies, and it's just, it's a word I can't stand.
But movies about women, right?
Yes. And so I thought, okay, well, what about literature? You have Emma Bovary. You have Anna Karenina. Sure. You have Mrs. Dalloway. You have all the women that Toni Morrison ever wrote about. These are complex, interesting, unusual, layered characters, and you are on the journey with them. And so I think that fiction is a better home for a woman like that.
Thank you. What a perfect answer. So the novel is clearly so well researched. You started by saying you were in the New York Public Library with microfiche. That took me back, I don't want to say how many years.
Oh, yes.
But, you know, and I'm sure some of this translates to film, but for a novel, what went in to the preparation and writing of this novel? And maybe those are two separate questions.
Well, the research was monumental. If I had really known what I was in for when I started, I would have been a little more terrified than I was, but I just dove in. I remember at a certain point thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to learn nuclear physics. And I was a terrible student in science and math. Just, I was a theater geek, but as I was researching, I found things that I had very much in common with these characters. So, for example, I began to understand that for a scientist or a pure mathematician, the work is exactly like being an artist. You are possessed with the need to get to the truth. And that I could understand completely. You can be so possessed, for example, that a woman like Hannah could literally not see or completely take in the things that were happening around her in Germany in 1938, because as a woman, she had fought so hard to get to this position where she was actually taken more or less seriously. I mean, her lab was in the basement, as I write in the book. It was in the janitor's closet where they keep the brooms and the mops, but she had a lab. She had a collaboration, she had a partner. She was so fixated on those things, which were her passion, that the idea of leaving Germany became very, very difficult for her to even contemplate, because where was she ever going to recreate this situation?
Right.
And I understood that very, very well. And I also became fascinated by this race between the Allies and the Germans to develop the bomb, because as you know, if you've been to Los Alamos, I mean, so many of those scientists were Jewish or Eastern European refugees, people who had been displaced or kicked out by Hitler, who had families back in Germany. And their desire to get the bomb was very much fueled from an emotional place. Like, everybody knew if Hitler got the bomb, that would be the end of the world. I mean, England would be blown to smithereens. And so there was a very clear mission that I could understand. And all of that is just, it's like the soil for a great story. The stakes are high. They could really not be higher. And I will say that the dramatist in me definitely recognized that as, as a very thing I had going for me in the storytelling. And then as I began to learn about the history and see some of these juxtapositions, like the idea that Roosevelt died just not 116 days before the bomb was dropped. And Truman, the vice president, knew nothing about the bomb. So the scientists had a kind of a faith in Roosevelt as a man as a humanist. They had no idea who Truman was. And we didn't really either until he was told about the bomb. And he decided, to use it. Would that have happened if Roosevelt had lived longer? We don't know, but that element became a key turning point in my story. So as I was researching, I was incorporating things into the story. And then as the story demanded them, I would go back and do more research. And then I would find things that had to be in the story. And so everything kept feeding on itself and becoming more and more layered.
That's so fascinating, Jan. Thank you for that. And two questions emerged for me. One is, did you actually go to Los Alamos, the scene of the crime, if you will? And also, in this process of, it sounds like you just got more pulled into this whole story. At what point did you say, okay, everything else I'm working on has to be put aside because you were so compelled and driven to tell the story?
So the first question's very easy to answer. I went to Los Alamos. I went 3 or 4 times. I don't remember. I found it helpful and not helpful. I mean, Los Alamos is very, very different now than it was then. And the few things that remain, you know, Bathtub Row and Fuller Lodge, are sort of just these kind of isolated remnants. And you just don't, it's very hard to get a feeling of what that was like when there were still bulldozers and jackhammers. They were building it as the scientists arrived. And so my sense of that part of the story really came more from old pictures. I used the Atomic Heritage Archives a lot. And then also I was very lucky. I found a man named Jerry Hanks, whose father had been actually working on the Enola Gay and the bomb mechanism that, you know, that was going to go in the plane. And he had grown up in Los Alamos. So he had memories of being 6 years old and running around, you know, the campus. And that was incredibly helpful.
Yes, so that's an original source that you were able to pull upon. Yeah.
Yes, and those sources were much, much more helpful in a way. But there was a great tour that unfortunately I think has not, it's no longer being done, but it was like an old atomic tour of Los Alamos, and we got in a little, you know, a little van, and we were driven to all of the important spots around Los Alamos and sort of, you know, up in the mountains. And so if you were on this ridge, you'd be looking over this way. And so, and of course, everyone who was there had stories, you know, General Groves, his book. There are lots of stories about Oppenheimer and his love of horses and his love of riding in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the boys' school, the boys' ranch school, and, you know, Oppenheimer's idea that this was the place to do this project. So all of that informed my thinking. And then I just went inside and imagined it myself. And most people say I did a pretty good job. I got one reader who said that I got a few things wrong, and I'm sure I did. I'm certain, but I tried my best. In terms of your second question, when did I decide to put everything aside? Mm-hmm. This had been gnawing on me. I was becoming increasingly frustrated with not directing per se. I love directing. It's a great living. I was proud of everything I was doing. But, you know, once you finish directing, the show is the show. It's not really my show. And so that kept tugging on me. And I was very lucky. My manager found a book agent, and she was very interested in the story. And she said, I think if you write this story, I can sell it. And so that was not a promise. It was not, I mean, it wasn't.
It's a little encouragement.
A little bit of encouragement, which is really all a writer needs, is a little encouragement that somebody might be interested. And that was it. And I actually did turn down every job for a year. I told my agents, who were not at all happy, that I did not want to do any work except on this book. And I was in New York, which was very helpful because, when you live in LA, there are a lot of people who want to know what you're working on, and you sort of feel like, oh God, I don't exist. And, I'm working on a novel. And the first question is, well, is there a screenplay in it? So, but being in New York, I could really put myself in that little greenhouse and disappear. And I found out that I really loved the process of writing. Yeah.
Well, I have to say congratulations, because your book is really groundbreaking and very timely, given so many moral dilemmas that are facing us, and that we're witnessing how various questions are being handled. And I will keep politics out of this at the moment, but I do have to ask about your choice of this time, or was it, for delving into this and getting it out to the world? What was some of the factors in that for you?
I think that the first factor was thinking, here's this pure scientist working in Germany, putting blinders on so she doesn't really see what's going on outside, until the day that the Nazis march into the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and say, this is no longer an institute. This is no longer a research facility. This is an arm of the army. And all we are interested in is weapons. And of course, when that happened, that was right after Austria was annexed, and she was Austrian, and everyone had promised her all these protections and she wouldn't be touched. And not so much, as it turned out. She was actually turned in by a colleague and had to leave with about 6 hours before she would have been taken to the camps. So I thought, here's somebody who has witnessed what happens when pure science is taken over by the military and by politicians. She's witnessed it firsthand. And then she's going to go to Los Alamos, where it's much, much subtler, but there was a tension between the military and the scientists. So much so that when they started the project, they wanted the scientists to wear military uniforms and to be armed, soldiers, armed members of the military. And Oppenheimer was fitted for a uniform, and he was trying to convince, I think it was Hans Bethe, to, wear a uniform. And Bethe drew himself up with his, accent and his brilliance. And he said, I will discover the bomb as a professor. I will not discover the bomb as a soldier. And so right there is that tension between who's in charge of this project. Is it Oppenheimer, who's being given all of this free rein to bring the scientists together? Or is it actually the military who controls the base and then starts to spy on the scientists? And I just thought that juxtaposition of somebody who has seen what happens firsthand, then seeing it unfold again. It's like seeing history repeating itself. And as I did more research into America at that time, I discovered that America was incredibly anti-Semitic. I mean, way more than people know. Henry Ford, was publishing the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and there was in fact a big rally in Madison Square Garden where, the American Nazis addressed, I don't know, it was 60,000 people, something like that. So there were all these things that I didn't know as an aware Jewish identifying person. And it seemed to me that they were important to get out in a form that people might, let's just say that the form would be enticing enough, the story would be compelling enough that these details would matter and would not be sort of dry academic, guess what kind of, and so I really worked to weave those into the story in an interesting way, and I hope I succeeded.
Masterfully.
Oh, thank you. That was fishing for a compliment if I've ever done one. But
truthfully, I think, for me, that's the kind of the hallmark of a really well-crafted historical piece of fiction, is how those elements are woven in without being academic or pedantic or whatever, and really inform the trajectory of the characters and so forth. So, yeah, go ahead.
I would say that my work in film helped that a great deal, because in film, as a director and a writer, you're working with actors, and actors, they want to know why they're doing what they're doing. And so you can't sort of have history being some background thing, because history is lived by characters. There are people who are actually making history. And I was writing about many of those people. And so as a director, my first instinct is always to find out what a character wants. What's the motivation? And where's the conflict with the other character? So for me, these bits of history were fuel for the characters. I didn't see them as dry, things that didn't affect the characters. They affected the characters on a daily basis. So I do give a lot of credit to my work as a director and working with actors.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a wonderful segue, because I wanted to just delve for a moment into the gender aspect of this story. We are dealing with the 30s and 40s. Though the suffragist movement, which, by the way, raise your palms, everybody. Today's the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote, which I cannot even believe that they had to. Okay, we won't go there.
Right.
But Hannah's gender influenced her research, how she was received in various laboratories. Specifically, you also introduced some other characters. I don't know if they were composite characters. Alice Rivers in Los Alamos, yes. Karen Honig at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, contrasting to Hannah. And, you know, how did their beliefs about their roles as women and their behavior shed light on Hannah?
Well, to do the story justice and to do Lisa Meitner, the inspiration for the story justice, I felt that I needed to have the background of what a woman who was not a genius and not as, Lisa Meitner was doing equations under the covers when she was 8 years old, like somebody would be reading with a flashlight in bed. So this was her life, and she was very unusual. She was the first woman to teach at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, the first woman to run a department. I mean, she was the first, and often the first and only. Yeah. And the women at Los Alamos, I mean, there were many women, but they were the secretaries. Many of them were called human computer girls. They were the girls who actually did some of the adding up and the math.
Figures comes to mind, right?
Figures is very much that story. And, you know, there is another story about Lisa Meitner that I think is important. I did not choose to deal with it in the book because I took the book in a different direction. But, you know, she and her partner discovered nuclear fission. And you can argue, I think, very correctly, that she was more responsible for the discovery than he was. They had been working together when she had to flee. He couldn't work without her. And so he came to meet her secretly because he was not supposed to be consorting with a Jew on any level. And they devised experiments together, and then he went back to Berlin, did the experiments, and sent the results to her on a postcard via courier. Now, he did not know what had happened when when this experiment actually did split the atom. Mm-hmm. He was completely puzzled. He sent it to her. She was, and I do love this because it's got to be somewhere in the movie, she was snow skiing with her nephew, puzzling over these bizarre results of this experiment, and she stopped and she started to do equations in the snow with her ski pole. And she said, I know what happened. The only way to account for this is if we split the atom. So he published the paper, and he did not put her name on it because she was Jewish, and a paper published in Germany at that time could not have a Jewish name or it would have been discredited. So I can give him a pass on that. But what was very upsetting to me is that he was given the Nobel Prize. And he got up, she was in the audience, and I read her diary and her letters from the time, and she wrote, I can't believe that he didn't even mention my name. And these are people who collaborated for 20 years together. You know, the idea that he had somehow convinced himself that she had not contributed is outrageous. Yeah. And the fact that the Nobel Committee bought into that version of the story is also outrageous. And she was, she was wronged. She deserves that Nobel Prize even posthumously. So
you'll help with that.
Well, I do. I actually have a conversation with somebody who is key in that sort of scientific political world, because we would love to do something to get her that prize if possible. But you also asked about the other women. So, you know, I felt in order to show
Contrast.
how,
And I was curious if you know, if those other women actually existed, or if you used, you know, sort of creative license to create this contrast of
that
characters.
it was really the second. I wanted to have other women so I could really point out how exceptional she was.
Mhm.
Not that, I mean, any woman who was working at Los Alamos was exceptional, but you know, she was just on a completely different level. So.
And you know, your novel also was reminiscent of another novel, and I'm racking my brains trying to think of it, about Einstein's.
Oh yes, the other Einstein.
The other Einstein, and you know, that novel really made me hate Einstein.
Well, you know, with these great men, there's a lot to hate usually when you dig a little deeper. I mean, Otto Hahn, you know, he took the Nobel Prize without crediting her. He stayed in Germany when he well knew what the Germans were up to with the concentration camps. And Lisa Meitner, you know, she wrote a letter to him that excoriated him on both counts.
Oh.
And then she didn't send it. And I think, you know, that she had that. We all know, you know, that there's a place where you're not supposed to get angry. You're supposed to get along. And she felt isolated enough, I think, that she didn't want to lose one person who really had been, you know, a friend and a collaborator, even though he had done these horrible things.
Right, right. So you did hint at something, Jan, that I wanna pick at just a little bit here. And that is, you said somewhere in the film we'll get that ski scene.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry, but I heard that, and and it was actually my last question before we open it up to the audience, and that is, as a filmmaker, do you have plans to, you know, convert this to a screenplay? And do you have thoughts about who you would cast as Hannah, Stefan, Jack, etc.?
Okay. I can't. That was a Freudian slip if there ever was one.
Sorry, and I just picked.
No. Yeah, you picked right up on it. I give you all the credit for that. We are in talks about a potential film. It is not a done deal. It hasn't been announced.
We won't tell.
So, you know, Hollywood has a way of always disappointing you. So I'm not counting on anything,
Right.
Except I do think it would be a great story, a great film.
And to New Mexico to film it.
Well, that's quite possible. You know, my idea for Hannah is probably one that most people would be very surprised about, because she's much younger than I think, you know, most people who read the book sort of go, well, you'll get Rachel Weisz or you'll get Natalie Portman.
Mm-hmm.
And all respect to them, but Hannah was like in her late 20s. You know, we forget that scientists who had not done their brilliant work by the time they were 30 were considered washed out. And the military at that time was comprised of incredibly young men. I mean, you could be an officer easily by the time you were 26 or 27. And so my thoughts about the casting reflect that sense that even I think Oppenheimer looked as if he was 70. I mean, he was skeletal and, you know, with the eyes. I think he was 32 when the bomb was dropped. So, so my whole idea about casting is really based on a much younger cast than I think people imagine.
Mhm.
So I think the greatest actress of our time, the most intelligent, the most fearless, is Saoirse Ronan, who was in
Love her.
Little Women,
Yeah.
who was in Lady Bird, who
Mhm.
also I saw in Mary Queen of Scots. She played Mary,
I
and
saw.
I mean, she burned up the screen with her presence, with her sense of integrity, and her brilliance. And so, since I saw that movie, it's been very hard for me to think of anyone else.
Oh, that's so great. And
Um,
she's Aryan looking.
I'm sorry.
She's Aryan looking.
You know, when you see her with dark hair,
Oh. Mhm.
and Hannah, I mean, Hannah, when she was young, there are pictures of her, and she's very, very pretty. She's very dainty. She's tiny, small boned.
Mhm.
By the time she gets older, you know, she looks more like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you know, but, and with that same sort of frail, delicate kind of sense, but blue eyes, you know, very, you know, hide as if she could hide any secret in the world. And so to me, now I did see Unorthodox. I don't know if you guys saw
Yeah.
that.
Yes, Shira Haas.
Yes, she is Sabine.
She's a revelation.
She's Hannah's cousin in my mind, who's a
Okay,
very important
perfect.
figure in the book. Um,
Oh, I
so,
want this film made. So the cat's out of the bag, but we won't tell anybody. We'll just
okay, you just light candles, please, and hope.
yes. And with that, Jan, thank you. This has been so informative and insightful, and your passion is so evident. And we really thank you for bringing us, Hannah, and telling this important story.